Number 9. Redonda Vaught. Redonda Vaught was working as a nurse at a highly respected hospital in Tennessee in 2017 when she accidentally killed a 75-year-old patient by giving them the wrong medication. She withdrew what she believed was a sedative from an electronic medication cabinet, not realizing that it was actually a paralyzing agent. By the time Vaught's mistake was discovered, she had already given it to the patient, who stopped breathing and was left brain dead. Vaught took responsibility for the mistake in a Tennessee Board of Nursing hearing and said that she was distracted by a trainee while retrieving the medication. She also admitted to becoming complacent at her job and expressed deep remorse, stating that she thinks every day about how her actions caused someone to die. The former nurse was convicted on felony counts of criminally negligent homicide and gross neglect of an impaired adult. She'll never work in the healthcare field again, but her record will be expunged if she stays out of trouble during her 3-year probation sentence. The case was highly controversial as nurses rallied around Vaught, citing her case as a disturbing precedent for the future criminalization of medical mistakes. On the other hand, the widow of the woman she accidentally killed had been hoping for the maximum punishment, which Vaught did not receive. But Vaught believes the loss of her career and the ways the incident have forever changed her are punishment enough, and many agree. After all, she has to spend the rest of her life knowing that she took someone's life in a moment of carelessness. Number 8. Christopher Gordon and Angelica James. Christopher Gordon already had 2 domestic violence convictions under his belt when he was charged with felony domestic assault in Louisville, Kentucky in 2020. He had allegedly attacked his girlfriend, Angelica James, for talking to the mechanic who was working on her car. Despite his established record, the district attorney opted not to prosecute the case and allowed Gordon to plead down to a misdemeanor-level charge. It was his 3rd domestic violence conviction in less than 3 years, yet he walked away with just 2 years of probation and a stern warning to stay away from his victim. Earlier this year, police arrested Gordon on suspicion of shooting Miss James dead in front of her 2 children. To many, the murder was entirely preventable, if only those in a position of power to intervene more heavily had chosen to do so. They had all the information they needed to know that Gordon was a serial abuser, and that this pattern pointed towards the potential for even worse offenses in the future. But instead of taking a heavy-handed approach, some might say the prosecutors treated the case as an inconsequential backwater and not taken it seriously enough. Domestic violence activists and experts have pointed out that all the signs were there, and that it's hardly surprising that when left to his devices, Gordon escalated his abuse to a deadly level. He is currently facing a murder charge in connection with the fatal shooting. While it's unfortunate that someone had to pay with their lives for the justice system to pay the kind of attention to the case that it is now, Gordon probably won't be back on the streets anytime soon if he's convicted. Number 7. Jennifer and James Crumley. It's not incredibly common for parents to be criminally charged over their children's wrongdoings, even if they're minors. But when a young man named Ethan Crumley shot 4 people dead at a high school in Pontiac, Michigan, detectives found that his parents had ignored crucial warnings that could have possibly prevented the massacre. In the days leading up to the incident, one teacher contacted Jennifer and James Crumley after they caught their son searching for ammunition online, and another teacher reached out to the couple after finding a violent drawing that he had made. Instead of trying to get to the bottom of the teen's obvious issues, Jennifer failed to respond to the teachers and even joked with him about how he needed to learn how to not get caught shopping for ammo at school. The Crumleys had opposed having their son transferred out of the school, and they also failed to disclose that he not only had access to a deadly weapon, but they had bought it for him as a gift. Authorities later revealed that the gun was kept in an unlocked drawer, and that both Jennifer and her son had bragged about it on social media after buying it. Considering the degree to which Jennifer and James failed to heed the obvious warning signs that their son was capable of committing a horrific act of violence, prosecutors charged them each with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. The case is ongoing. Number 6. India Cummings. One day in 2016, police responded to a call about a mental health emergency in the small city of Lackawanna, just outside Buffalo, New York. While they were there, 27-year-old India Cummings carjacked a vehicle and got into a police chase. Officers eventually caught up to her and took her into custody, later noting that she was acting erratic. They took India to a holding center, where she continued to act strangely for the next 17 days. Logbook entries described how the troubled young woman smeared food in her cell, was often naked, and threw trash around, among other strange behaviors. It was clear that India's mental health was suffering, and it soon became evident that she was also in physical danger. She stopped eating and drinking, seemed increasingly confused and detached from reality, had poor hygiene, and bore signs of an arm injury and possible kidney failure. India was put on 24/7 watch as she languished in her cell without proper medical care. At one point, she told a deputy that she was dying, but no urgent action was taken. A mental health expert was finally called in to evaluate the woman and concluded that she needed to be hospitalized. But it didn't happen, and the next day, India was found unconscious in her cell. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition and died from a combination of ailments, including cardiac arrest, severe dehydration, malnutrition, and organ failure. India also had a broken arm, which happened during her arrest, according to a state medical review board. No criminal charges were ever brought against staff members for failing to act when it was clear that India needed help, despite the review board's conclusion that the treatment India received was so grossly incompetent and inadequate as to shock the conscience. This preventable and tragic case is just one example of the thin line that exists between the realm of not noticing something as it's happening and turning a blind eye to it. There are still many unanswered questions surrounding India's death, which added to years-long suspicions that inmates at that particular holding center are often ignored and left to agonize as their health and mental condition deteriorate. Number 5. Megan Severson. Megan Cheryl Severson was driving along US Route 52 one day in late 2019 when she crashed into the back of a Saturn at 59 miles per hour, 95 kilometers per hour. She had just switched lanes and failed to notice that the traffic in front of her was stopped until a half second before the collision. The accident involved 4 vehicles and multiple people were injured. A 33-year-old man named Anthony Kelly Cowino tragically died when he was ejected from the Saturn that Severson hit. The young woman told the police that by the time she realized traffic wasn't moving, she was unable to avoid the crash. She claimed that she wasn't eating, drinking, or using the phone at that time. But something seems to have pulled her attention away from the road in front of her, based on surveillance footage that shows Severson taking no evasive action, according to a law enforcement analysis. The investigation found that Severson wasn't using her phone, leaving distraction as the only possible explanation, absent of hitting the cars on purpose. She pleaded guilty to vehicular homicide earlier this year and offered a tearful apology to Cowino's family in court. The surviving relatives were involved in negotiating a plea agreement that Severson worked out with prosecutors that will involve 123 days of jail time, a 5-year state sentence, and 5 years of probation. Honoring a request from Cowino's loved ones, the judge ordered Severson to serve her first 90 days in jail this year and to report to jail every year on the anniversary of the man's death until 2026 to serve out a portion of her remaining time. She's also required to speak about the tragedy at a driver's education class. Both the judge and the prosecutor acknowledged that what happened was a terrible accident, but they both intend on having the case serve as a cautionary tale that will warn others against the consequences of distracted driving. Number 4. Remote tuberculosis outbreak. Jennifer McNabb was the only public health nurse working in the remote village of Pangniturk in Nunavut, Canada last year, when she found herself dealing with a tuberculosis outbreak. The infectious disease was spreading too fast for her to track and treat everyone on her own, so she began contacting her superiors and letting them know that they urgently needed to send more healthcare workers to the community. Located just below the Arctic Circle, Pangniturk is an isolated settlement that can only be reached by plane. In order to get residents the treatment they needed, McNabb was relying on the government to follow through. But her pleas for help went overlooked, as health officials hesitated to acknowledge the issue, according to the Globe and Mail. It wasn't until 2 months after the illness began to spread that they declared an outbreak and allocated resources to contain it. Tuberculosis is curable, and many people view it as a disease of the past. But it's still a major problem among Indigenous communities in parts of Canada, where tuberculosis rates are exponentially higher than they are elsewhere throughout the country. This is partially due to economic and health disparities that make Native communities more vulnerable to its spread. A Globe and Mail report by journalist Kelly Grant found overwhelming evidence indicating that if the Nunavut government had responded more quickly to McNabb's requests, the infection rates would most likely have been much lower. Instead, they left her to deal with it on her own, and it proved impossible as tuberculosis spread like wildfire among the population of around 1,500 residents. The failure to take prompt action runs contrary to the federal government's bold promise to eradicate the disease by 2030. Accomplishing this goal will be incredibly difficult if the response times to requests for assistance continue in this manner, which results partially from chronic staffing shortages that seem to have no end in sight. Number 3. Joshua McLemore. Police in Seymour, Indiana responded to a concerned call about the well-being of a man named Joshua McLemore and found him naked and incoherent. They eventually convinced him to voluntarily go to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation, but he allegedly pulled a nurse's hair and was sent to the Jackson County Jail before he received adequate treatment. McLemore had a history of methamphetamine abuse and had been in the emergency rooms numerous times for the consequences of it. The doctor he saw before going to jail had treated him on previous occasions and was familiar with how he acted when he was high. She told Indiana State Police that McLemore's increasingly erratic behavior, unfocused state, and rambling speech were inconsistent with his typical symptoms. He bit a chunk of paint off the squad car as he was being put inside and cracked the windshield with his feet. Once he arrived at the jail, he was immediately put in a padded cell where all of his activities were captured on surveillance footage. Employees tasked with watching the cameras switched duties every 4 hours without communicating much to one another about what happened before or after their shift, leaving them tragically unaware that McLemore was barely eating or drinking. During a stay, he barely spoke, only showered twice, and his cell was routinely covered in spilled food, drinks, and urine. 18 days after arriving at the jail, McLemore was taken to the hospital in critical condition. He was lethargic and had lost 45 pounds and died from organ failure just 2 days later. An official investigation concluded that jail staff had been negligent and that McLemore likely died from a prolonged lack of attention from jail staff. But the evidence came up short of constituting a crime, and no charges were filed. Number 2. Texting and walking. A 67-year-old New Jersey woman's ordinary day took a disastrous, unexpected turn one day in 2017 when she got distracted with her phone during a walk in Plainfield and failed to watch where she was going. The senior citizen was passing by a business and looking down at her screen when she tripped and fell into an open sidewalk access door. She fell 6 feet and was seriously injured as a curious crowd of onlookers gathered around. Firefighters rescued the woman from the hole and rushed her to the emergency room. Surveillance footage of the incident suggests that she was walking and texting right before the accident, and that a distraction put her in harm's way. Workers had the access door open because they were repairing gas lines in the area that day, and the elderly pedestrian might have noticed this if she had been paying more attention to her surroundings. With the way technology has taken over our lives, it's normal to see people staring at their screens, seemingly oblivious to the world around them. But cautionary tales like this serve as a sobering reminder of the very real danger that someone can put themselves in by getting absorbed into their phones while multitasking. Number 1. Lauren K. Scott. After being intimate during the early morning hours one day in 2017 with her then-boyfriend Robert Anderson Jr., 23-year-old adult film actress Lauren K. Scott apparently started paying too much attention to her phone for her man's liking. He got upset and asked her to leave his home in Pinellas Park, Florida. Instead of complying, Scott allegedly got angry and punched Anderson in the face, leaving him with a cut and swollen lip. Police arrested the young woman on suspicion of misdemeanor domestic battery and booked her into the county jail. As it turned out, Scott was actually married at the time. She sorted out her legal issues in Florida and then returned to Los Angeles, where she had been living with her husband before she got arrested. Sadly, the troubled actress's life continued along the wrong path, and she passed away last year from a drug overdose after battling addiction for years. Scott had reportedly been to rehab several times and was doing her best to get sober when she lost her battle against her demons. Thanks for watching. Would you rather trip and break your ankle while walking and texting, or lose your driver's license for 6 months? Let me know in the comments below.